Hello and welcome to this Apollo podcast. I'm Tom Marks, the editor of Apollo, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Gatiss. Mark is an actor, comedian and writer, well known as the co-creator of The League of Gentlemen, writer of Doctor Who, co-creator of Sherlock, in which he also appears as Mycroft Holmes, Sherlock's brother, and has had acting credits in everything from Wind in the Willows to Game of Thrones. But today we're talking about painting with Mark because one of his personal passions is the work of the modern British painter John Minton. And this summer he'll be releasing with BBC4 his new film, John Minton, The Lost Man of British Art. Mark, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
Mark, tell me first where you first came across Minton's works and what interested you so much about them.
Now, I was on a trip to London, which I think must have been a family trip. I was about 14, 15, and I went to the National Portrait Gallery. I've always loved painting, and I haunt galleries, I always have, and the National Portrait Gallery is my favourite. And I went, and I was very taken by the sort of the modern wing, or as because it still goes up to about 1960, I think. But I was very taken by the sort of post-war stuff, which I didn't really know anything about. And across the room, I just saw this self-portrait of Minton, and it just sort of haunted me. He had this amazingly expressive face. Someone said as long as a fiddler's elbow. These great big kind of cow eyes, just desperately sad. That's what I think struck me about it. And I remember reading up the little thing saying who he was and his contribution to British art and his suicide. And I think I went home and read up about it. And then very shortly afterwards, I saw the Lucian Freud picture, which kind of sealed the deal in a way.
Quite a difficult painting.
Oh, it's an extraordinary painting. And I just became slightly obsessed with him, I think. And also, as a young gay man, I was drawn irresistibly to the sort of sadness of the story and what might have been behind it. So I kind of ended up reading a lot around it and then, just sort of following his work, I suppose.
Where were you looking at those pictures? In books, I suppose?
Yes.
He hasn't always been a man on display for the last 30 years, as it were.
No, in a funny way, you know how it is. You can stumble across things. I always try and when I'm in a new city, if I've got enough time, I'll go to the gallery, and I do remember sort of stumbling across a couple in various regional galleries. And last year, Ritu, who's on the couch here, we were in Oxford, and we went to this restaurant, which is just full of pictures. And as we were paying the bill, I looked across and went, "That's Minton." And it was a picture of Oscar Wood from 1941. And I emailed Simon at Pallant House. He said, "I've been looking for that for ages."
That's Simon Martin, the director.
You can't just find that. He was very prolific, so you just sort of stumble across them.
Was that because he was selling things to restaurants, or because
I think this particular place
market?
has a policy of sort of filling its walls with great stuff.
So it was the portraits that first drew you in, but then you've collected some work as well, more recently. Is that right?
I've got 3 portraits. An ink, a pencil, and an oil, and portraits are kind of my favourite thing. But I was very intrigued by the landscapes, particularly the foreign landscapes, and the colour in them. It just it's very, very beautiful and very bold and striking. And then I think through the Elizabeth David cookbooks, and I love the idea that quite a lot of households actually accidentally still have Minton in them. Quietly dusty in the kitchen, because that book was a phenomenon.
That was Mediterranean food, Mediterranean cookery.
Yeah.
That book that just
it
taught
changed
so many
everything.
people after the war about what olive oil was.
The anti-austerity book, and it was deliberately pitched as that. I mean, some of the recipes are actually. I mean, how you could eat them now? Never mind on rationing. But it was like a sort of. It was an aspirational book. It was like, we can do this again, or we can live this Mediterranean lifestyle. And then French country cooking as well. And I think he poured his sort of heart and soul into them. They're really quirky, beautiful little things. There's little illustrations of lobsters and fruit, and it's sort of incredibly fecund. You just kind of, even though it's black and white.
I always think that the melon on it is somehow is a repetition of the whole horizon. So like a whole of the Mediterranean.
Absolutely, yes.
It
makes you want to go there and eat everything, doesn't it?
And I mean, just To get into talking about this film and how you came to make it, I thought one way in would be to think about you've written these novels, the Lucifer Box novels, and you take an artist as your protagonist, and the Royal Academy in the novels is the Secret Services in disguise, and I wonder whether you feel like coming to the art world from your place as a writer, as an actor, it seems like a kind of coded place of secrets and so on, or was it something quite
I just thought
different?
it was quite a nice idea. And I was looking to, everybody is, when you're sort of trying to create a detective, essentially, or any kind of spy, you're always drawing a line from Sherlock Holmes or James Bond or Hercule Poirot. So you have to come up with a thing. And I thought, actually, I don't know if there's ever been a sort of artist detective, or I don't know, maybe. But I quite like the idea that the Royal Academy was essentially the Secret Service, and there were different divisions of it, where the watercolorists are the most deadly and all the least likely things. But I don't know, I've never really thought of it like that. I mean,
But the art world, not
yes,
a mysterious place, or a place
I suppose
that tries
like
to guard itself.
like anything, like any sort of slightly mysterious thing, it has a mystique all of its own, and also a desire to keep that mystique. But like most things you discover when you get behind the curtain, it's just everybody's just doing the same stuff, aren't they? And I'm sure I was talking to someone about this the other day, about the way that when paintings start to fetch colossal sums of money and become barter, that you lose something fundamental about it. Even with great work, you think it's now just hidden away in a vault or on someone's wall, maybe never to be seen again. I just watched, there's a very interesting series on Sky Arts about recreating lost paintings, and it was the Tamara de Lampicia, I've discovered it's now pronounced. I was watching yesterday, and the painting is missing, probably looted by the Nazis, but may well just be in someone's collection. I think the others are destroyed in fires or whatever, but the idea that picture might be out there, and the fact when they were trying to reproduce it, the texture of the canvas, it's virtually impossible to get to one because they're all in the collections of extremely rich people.
So that is a sense in which the art world has its kind of private patina, but this is quite a personal film that you've made, and let's talk about what some of the greatest surprises were for you about Minton while you were making it.
Well, what happened was I've been thinking about this for a long time. I proposed a drama about him a long time ago, maybe 12 years ago, because it occurred to me that he's this incredible sort of intersection. It's a bit like Goodbye to Berlin. You start with someone, and Johnny Minton knew everybody, so it's a way into Bacon and Freud and the Roberts and Keith Vaughan and Daniel Farson and this amazing Soho world. I thought, this is really interesting.
And the writers too.
And the writers, yes, of course. Yeah. McLaren Ross and Dylan Thomas. It's just it's an incredible thing. I often think about any kind of circle. You sometimes find it quite hard to believe. It's like, good morning, Manet, good morning, Monet. And everybody knew each other. Oh, hello, George Bernard Shaw. It's extraordinary.
I'm sure they'll say that about you. Benedict Cumberbatch
within this room. So there was no interest in the drama all those years ago. And I kept coming back to Minton thinking, really got to get these people while they're still with us. And I couldn't get anyone interested. So I made the documentary myself. And then, happily, the BBC... retrospectively commissioned it after we got halfway through, because they
so you put it all together.
Yeah.
Without any commission at that
point.
Eventually,
not at that point, because I thought, I want to do this. It's a passion, and there's a lot more people around than you'd imagine, mostly who were students in the 50s, but obviously they're all in their 80s now. So without being too doomy about it, it was quite important to get there.
And was it a different John Minton that you discovered, and when you look at the film now, to the John Minton you had in your mind beforehand?
A bit. I mean, funny enough, going back to first principles, what struck me about seeing that picture when I was a teenager was the sadness on his face. And then what was really interesting was reading up and seeing how many people said he was the life and soul of the party. So there's this strange tension at the heart of him, which I suppose is a kind of manic depression, certainly a mania.
And certainly in the last years, he committed suicide only at the age of 39.
Yeah, but there's the only surviving footage of him is him dancing. He's a famously wild dancer, and it's incredible. He's just like a whirling dervish, but then his face just falls. Someone said he had the face of a Renaissance saint that's been left too close to the fire. It's fantastic. And so it was, I suppose it was, I got more of a sense of his kind of joy. And I tried very hard to make sure that the whole piece isn't sort of too somber, because it's full of extraordinary energy, but it's the energy of a manic person. He's incredibly inspired by suddenly encountering another artist or going to Corsica, and the work just pours out of him. You can sense it. It's like he's having a wonderful time, and then it stops, or he just goes somewhere else. He goes to a darker place, and and he said he didn't want to live past 40. He's sort of on a track, unfortunately.
There's that amazing painting of him teaching with the faculty of the Royal College, Roderick Moynihan, I think, where he is just sitting apart from the rest of the faculty, as if he has this whole dark space around him.
I mean, in that strange way, I'm sure that picture, they'll have all posed separately, but the fact that the choice was made to separate him, he looks so isolated. It's a beautiful picture, and it says everything in his big black sort of duffel coat, and he's just desperately sort of sad look, and he's apart.
And yet he was a very inspirational teacher, which we'll come on to. Let me ask you, though, about this idea of him being a lost man. I mean, is that, in a sense, you feel like he himself was a little bit lost, or you feel like the art establishment and galleries haven't done enough to promote him?
It sort of works both. I wanted to call it the lost romantic, but the danger is that sounds like the poets, and you've only got a short little thing on the screen for people to understand what the program's about. But it kind of works both ways, because yes, he was a lost soul, but he's neglected, I think. But I hate that idea of a program saying you won't have heard of this person, because my first instinct is yes, I have. And you get cross about that. So I didn't want to do that. But then he's not really as well known as I think he should be. It's partly because he died so young and so long ago. And interestingly, the Parent House centenary retrospective last year, the reviews were very good, but they still sort of said he's kind of, middling.
And I suppose he was moving in circles with Lucian Freud, Francis Bacon, John Craxton and others, but they went on and painted for decades more, and the legend became about them.
Yeah, definitely. And there was a point where he was the leader of the pack, and the others found that very difficult, and he fell back. He lost his way. He didn't know what he wanted to do, because abstract was just taking over everything. That's clear. He got into spats with students about the American New Wave and didn't know what to do. And so the last pictures are very experimental but slightly desperate. These huge history paintings, Death Nelson and Coriolanus and the dice throwers. Actually, I think they're very impressive, but it's like he doesn't know what to do. He's like, I'll try this today, I'll try this. But then that's hand in hand with a sort of self-destruction, which means he didn't want to carry on. So he didn't know what he wanted to do next except die. I mean, he accepted a commission, I think 2 days before he died. He was in Scotland drawing. No, and then, but I suppose that's what you can never fathom about people who are suicidal. It's like, I'll do it today, and it's done. So as I say, it's been an amazing journey, and certainly talking to these people who knew him and loved him, who have such vivid memories of him, Peter Blake and Bridget Riley, who've become legendary figures who they smile as soon as they mention him.
And do you think that is the case, that his legacy is perhaps more persistent among the artists of that generation and artists who have followed, looking at him?
I guess, it's hard to say, isn't it? Because everybody starts. You actually start by copying people. It's how we all start, and you're deliberately copying old masters, etc. And then you develop your own style. But Peter Blake said he really owns a great debt to him, particularly in his sort of collagey works.
And you mentioned that people might have a Minton in their kitchen, and this sense that in one way Minton isn't lost to us at all, because it's a visual style that a lot of us would recognise. He did a lot of book jackets for novels, for books of poetry, for the cookery books. Yeah. So he's there. Were you always as interested in the illustrations?
Yes, I love pen and ink, and I think his style is incredibly attractive. He's got really incredible sort of fluidity to it. We interviewed Wally Fawkes, the cartoonist, Trog, who's 94, I think, who used to play oboe in the 100 Club. and Minton used to come with his students, and there's the cover of one of the magazines which he did, which has Wally Fawkes in it, and he's just because he's completely got it, and you can sense the atmosphere of this densely packed club full of young people dancing, and the musicians going crazy, and he's a real master with that. And I'm not uncritical. I think his paintings do lack psychological depth, or the portraits certainly do. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Freud of Minton, it's a devastating picture. It's stunning. In fact, some of his friends were upset and Freud said he thought it was a death portrait. It's just so raw, incredible piece of work, and Minton's portraits don't really do that. They're much more, I suppose, in a way, sort of surface,
and quite stylish.
Yes, and they're mostly of attractive young men, which is a great idea.
Is that another
more of an art?
Because thinking about another thing that is perhaps an art of losing, as it were, is that in some senses Minton has sometimes been thought of as a nostalgic artist, or an artist who captures a world that might be lost to anybody from actual experience. That could be in the Mediterranean pictures at a time when those places weren't accessible to most people, in the neo-romanticism. But I also wondered about, for you, whether kind of delving into the subject, is there a nostalgia for a kind of lost Soho in the film too?
Oh yes, I mean, it's such a vibrant place and time, but I'm getting better at nostalgia than I used to be. The Elizabethans thought that nostalgia was actually a diagnosable illness, and I think they're probably right. I read a thing yesterday saying that 70% of Britons think that things were better in the old days, But we've always thought that. It's the myth of the golden age, isn't it? And I'm terribly nostalgic about so many things, but I'm better at it than I used to be, because I want to move forward. That's what everybody's always trying to do. So, for instance, with Soho has for so long been this sort of slightly forbidden, naughty place, and it is dying. It's being corporatized and made anodyne. But all that means is that energy is going somewhere else. And what will happen is that Soho will be totally gentrified, and then in about 100 years' time, it'll become very poor, and then everything will move back into it. But that's evolution. It's sad because it's had this special thing for so long, and particularly in Minton's time, it must have been incredible. And the as you say, the kind of confluence of artists, writers, poets,
these places like the Colony Room,
drunks. But then over all that, there's this patina of the actual what it must have been like. And Bacon and Minton, I think, were the workers, and the Cahoon and McBride, who had this extraordinary brief fame, but they just got pissed and they didn't work. And Minton was able to hammer it and then go home and produce incredible amounts of stuff, and that's the missing part of that thing. And the sort of romance of the drunk is all very well in small doses, but imagine living with those people
and being productive. But it got to him. He was quite a troubled man nonetheless, for all the joy, and you mentioned his manic depression. I suppose also had quite a complex relationship at the time with his sexuality, in terms of homosexuality still illegal in Britain at the time, but he was quite forthright in writing letters to the press and things about the
that was a discovery for me. I mean, it's very interesting that he was an unhappy homosexual. He struggled with it. He didn't, I think, really want to be gay, and he had a very particular type, and was just rough trade. And but he's kind of jaunty about it as well. He's sort of strangely unapologetic. And then there was this thing which was a real discovery. Mary Stopes wrote a letter to the Listener complaining about another letter or an article about Oscar Wilde, and she was a friend of Lord Alfred Douglas and totally bought his version of events, and it's this horrible letter about Oscar Wilde and stable boys, all nonsense. Anyway, Minton replied in 1950, essentially outing himself, and I was very moved by that. And he actually said to a friend, I don't know where I've got my crusading spirit from, and it's probably the end of my career. And it wasn't, but at the same time, when he was desperate to become an associate academician and didn't get it, he was devastated. And you don't know whether conversations were had, But I think he's not exactly a sort of lost poster boy of gay rights, but he was a very, very brave man. And to do that 7 years before Wolfenden and 17 years before the law was actually amended is amazing.
And he also had these relationships with artists, but that weren't with Michael Ayrton, who he knew very well, who he hadn't come out to for many years. He was quite guarded in certain points of his career, but as you say, it seems that he then opened out in the 50s.
I think he was in love with Ayrton. I think he sort of wrote to him and confessed it all, but there were a lot of those kind of passionate friendships which sort of slightly crucified him. I think he did that a lot and then didn't know what to do with himself. But he absorbed a lot of influences, and then as you say, he kind of develops this slightly crusading spirit later on. But I don't know. It might be to do with his sort of mood swings that he suddenly felt like he could do it. I mean, there were loads of things we didn't have room to put in, and lots of fantastic stories which weren't quite germane to it. But there was one about when he was living with Keith Vaughan. He was on his way back, and he saw this friend of theirs with a policeman walking towards the house, and he absolutely broke into a sweat of terror. But it was his bloke's new boyfriend. The policeman just came in and had a cup of tea, and then they went to bed. It was great. But, you can imagine in that moment, that terror was extremely real. So to be as bold as he was is quite something.
And to think about another type of boldness in his painting, and actually how his process of making art, because you're a painter yourself.
I dabble.
You dabble, but it's one of your hobbies. And I just wonder, even as a Sunday painter, have you been thinking through Minton? Do you learn things about actually paint and process, and what in particular?
The stuff I love, and I think it really it's there in that first portrait that I saw, and I still love. I love unfinished pictures. I've always loved them, even if it's deliberate. There's something marvelous about that, I think, and his dry brushwork I find really interesting. Just doing a lot of detail and then a kind of sketchiness around it is very appealing, and I do that myself. I think that's where I got that from. And the older I get as well, the more I love colour. As a sort of reformed teenage emo, they'd be called now, wouldn't they? All heavy fringes and big black coats, and I just love colour. I love it, and those Corsican pictures and those brilliant...
And the Jamaican pictures too.
Mate, it's stunning, isn't it? And those London Dockland ones, those travel posters and things. I just think they're so striking, and I'd love to have them on the wall for every possible reason, but an awful lot of it just because they're so sort of... Weirdly, they're so cheerful. And yet, especially those Jamaican pictures you mentioned, there's a sort of threat in them, which I find really interesting. It's always there.
Is it about the light and not quite knowing?
I don't know if I've been to Jamaica, and I found it. I looked at those pictures again in a different light, because he gets it completely. There's a sort of throb on the island of potential, but also a sort of violence in them, and those huge great leaves, and that wonderful recently discovered picture, the picture discovered in a shed after 60 years. Of that little sort of shack and all those people. There's so many little narratives in that. There's so many things going on, But so I think that's interesting. It's sort of him, isn't it? He does this extraordinary splash of vibrant Caribbean colour, but there's a sort of underlying darkness to it.
I was reading that you had made these monologues last year for the Queers series. You curated it or organised the series, and that was to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, or at least in certain places for certain people in England and Wales.
The whole thing is about I had to qualify. Every interview I did, it was a qualification, because it's extraordinary. It wasn't actually decriminalised in Scotland until 1980. Northern Ireland, 2000. Amazing.
And one of the films was a monologue partly inspired by the painter Glyn Philpott. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, is Minton... Is he the one for you, or are there other painters, artists, other lost men of British art, say, who you'd like to make more films about?
It's a very good question. I mean, he's the main one, because I've always, he's the one I've been most attracted to and have collected and drawn to. I suppose I feel a bit like when I did my history of horror, I was asked to do science fiction, and I said, well, I do love sci-fi, but I'm passionate about horror, and that I think communicates through the work, and I would feel a bit like I was just presenting it rather than having a real investment. I mean, there are lots of very interesting people, but I think one of the reasons I've always loved portraits is that it's people's stories that draw you in as much as anything. Philpott is a fascinating story, and that whole idea of black artist models, so that was a really interesting way into that, because it's a totally separate discussion really, but the history of black gay culture in this country has so many gaps in it. Basically, the record has not survived, and so there are tiny fragments of things, one of which is artist models, you know, and Duncan Grant's Lover was also partly an inspiration for that monologue, and I find that really interesting. So I think there's all kinds of stories, but Minton is the one that I kind of focused on. Yeah.
And we look forward to watching more about Minton's story and your story with Minton's story, or of Minton's story, when the film John Minton, The Last Man of British Art is released. Mark Gatiss, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, pleasure.